Welcome everyone to this discussion today on sustainable innovation in African life sciences and medicine. My name is Waldo Steyn and I'm an executive at ENS, heading the commercial intellectual property practice here at the firm. Before I introduce the star of the discussion today, Joanne van Harmelen, I just want to ask that if you have any questions, can you please post that in the Q&A and not in the chat section in your screen. So without further ado, with me today is Dr. Joanne van Harmelen. She is a qualified patent attorney and leads the biotechnology and life sciences cluster here in our intellectual property department in the firm. Joanne holds a PhD in medical microbiology and vaccine development and has extensive experience in drafting and filing of patent applications in the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and chemical fields. She also assists clients with the assessment of patentability of their inventions and perform freedom to operate investigations for clients. Importantly, Jo also advises on sort of some commercial transactional aspects, as well as sort of some interesting aspects around other intellectual property areas. Joanne is a member of the South African Institute of Intellectual Property Law and the Southern African Research and Innovation Managers Association. She's also the secretary of the Licensing Executives Society of South Africa and co-chair the Life Sciences Committee of the Licensing Executives Society International. So after that introduction, I'm sure we're all interested to hear what Jo has to say. Our discussion today will be about the opportunities and risks posed for sustainable innovation in Africa and the role that intellectual property plays in this context. Doing business on the African continent certainly has risks, but also presents exciting opportunities. There are many challenges that the people in Africa face. These include, unfortunately, poverty, a high disease burden, and a general lack of infrastructure such as public services, roads, hospitals, schools, and internet connectivity. However, where there are challenges, there is room for innovation. And this is certainly true in Africa. Jo, can you maybe help us to understand as a point of departure what it is that we're talking about when we talk about sustainable innovation?
Sure, Waldo. Thank you very much for being the interviewer for me. It's great to be able to work together with you and present this topic, which I think is something that is incredibly important and is becoming more and more important as time goes on. Effectively, when we're talking about sustainable innovation, we're talking about the way that businesses implement new organizational and technological innovations that provide benefits, not only to the business, but also to the environment or to society. So it allows things like responsible and sustainable use of natural resources, or it might uplift the communities around a business. And it also provides for things like recycling or upcycling of waste products. It improves the way that inputs are used so that there is a reduction in the amount of input that needs to go into a business. It makes processes more efficient within a business. It improves the types of products and makes them more kind of sustainable and environmentally friendly from a business. And it also, because of the reduction in input and the kind of reuse of products, usually will result in some sort of a cost saving or perhaps an additional revenue stream that will come into the business. So there is a benefit to the business as well as, of course, to the environment and to society. And so what we see here is that companies that are built on these types of sustainable business models will often have a competitive advantage over their competitors, as well as being able to show that they are providing either an environmental and or a societal benefit too. And so on the African continent, we have often seen how African businesses will see a unique problem on the continent and they'll quickly utilize innovation which is out there to leverage that to solve their problem. And I think we're going to see this more and more often with sustainable innovation as well. so that what we end up with is an improved access to things like healthcare, to education, and hopefully a reduction in poverty and maybe a better quality of life on the continent. And then I think the other aspect, of course, apart from what is sustainable innovation, which is important and relevant in this discussion, is intellectual property. And I think the one thing to really consider in this context is the fact that wherever you have innovation, there will be intellectual property that is generated. And we've seen from market analyses by, S&P 500, for example, that up to 90% of the market value of a company now is sitting in its intellectual assets. And certainly in the sphere of sustainable innovation, that is definitely the case. And of course, you're looking at the normal registered types of IP, so your patents, your trademarks, your designs, things even like plant breeders' rights. But you're also looking at things like, the non-registered forms of intellectual property, which is very often going to be the case in sustainable innovation, where you're going to have confidential information that comes out of the way that you optimize things within your business, which may not even necessarily be patentable, but still has a value as confidential information, possibly as a trade secret or know-how. And so that really is a very important aspect of sustainable innovation.
Thank you, Jo. Jo, that market information about the S&P 500 companies and intellectual property being such a significant portion of that is absolutely astounding. And I wish we could really sort of imprint on our clients almost how important their focus on intellectual property should be for the very future of their businesses and for the creation of shareholder value. Yeah. But Jo, coming back to the topic then, sort of what role do you see life sciences companies playing in providing benefits to people in Africa?
Thanks, Waldo. I mean, I think the first thing to consider is, as we've seen, the African continent is very clever, very good at looking at what technology is out there in the sort of, I guess you could say, Western or Eastern world that's already been developed, and leveraging that type of intellectual property to come up with innovative solutions to African issues. So some of the things that we've seen is, the use of disruptive technologies to make things cheaper, to make them more relevant to the African situation, and maybe more accessible, particularly in things like medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, and also agro processes. I think the other thing which life sciences in Africa the companies can really do in this space is leverage our incredibly rich indigenous biological resources and our traditional knowledge. There is a huge amount, particularly in the life sciences, of diversity when it comes to indigenous resources in Africa, and of course also traditional knowledge relating to things like medicines and the way that crops are grown. And I mean there's a huge number of different things that are out there which can be leveraged. And so when you are a company in this space, there is a lot of opportunity, I think, to collaborate with local communities for access to these indigenous resources and to the use of their traditional knowledge to actually create some sort of an advantage, not only for the business, but actually for the community, and do it in a way that it is sustainable. So you can create jobs, you can provide technology transfer between the business and the communities, and you can also promote things like sustainable harvesting and conservation of indigenous biological resources in this way. And so that way you really provide a lot of opportunities at the same way being sustainable in the way that you innovate. So I think that's an important aspect in Africa that can be leveraged.
Thank you, Jo. Jo, what is the importance of sustainable innovation for African companies in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, when you are obviously in a business environment, and you're looking at sustainable innovation, you need to think about the great dichotomy that you see on the African continent. When you look at the difference in wealth and social development on the continent, where you have a large proportion of the population in many countries, I could probably say most countries, having high disease burden, high rates of poverty. There's often a general lack of infrastructure. So things like roads and schools and hospitals, even internet connectivity can be an issue. But I think that all, I mean, on the one hand is obviously a challenge, but on the other hand does really lend itself to innovation and to opportunities there. And as I said previously, you know, we've seen a lot of African businesses that have been able to grasp different types of technologies that are already in existence and use those to try and provide improved access to services, better healthcare, better education, community upliftment, and a better quality of life. So that's something where I think African countries, companies can really leverage sustainable innovation.
So Joe, sort of, I'm just thinking about sort of the fintech space specifically, and I know this is not particularly sort of perhaps relevant to this discussion, but something, as I understand it, what we saw in Africa was a significant uptake in mobile banking, bankability of people who were previously completely unbanked, financial services in the form of loans being provided. We work with a number of clients in that space who are coming up with very, very innovative solutions. Other solutions as well. And I think in the insurance space, there's a tremendous push to try and reach those previously unreachable almost customers as well. And the way I understand is that a lot of those technologies actually then transfer to sort of non-African jurisdictions as well as new channels and new ways to reach customers. Do you see sort of sustainable innovation specifically and what we're seeing in Africa as creating an opportunity to take new applications of existing technologies or these new innovations sort of that are completely new to back to non-African jurisdictions? And here I'm not only thinking about sort of obviously Africa, but sort of to places like India and the East, as well as to some of the Western countries.
Absolutely, very much so. You know, I think very often there's a problem which we see that is unique on the African continent. We solve a problem for it, but it would equally make things a lot cheaper, better, faster outside of Africa. You know, so when it comes to some of the diagnostic applications that have been developed in Africa, you know, you definitely could, for example, use those elsewhere. Likewise, things like delivery of medicines and delivery of blood supply, you know, it makes things cheaper, better, faster. So I think definitely there is a lot of scope, and particularly if it's to other developing countries. So when we're talking about, you know, the BRICS countries, the Brazils, Indias, Chinas of the world, absolutely, I think there's a lot of potential, you know, that can be moved across into those territories.
So Joe, you mentioned sort of the medical diagnostics here, and I know that when we prepared for this discussion, you said that there's actually quite a rapid adoption of those kind of technologies in Africa specifically. Can you maybe share with us a few examples that stand out for you? Sort of, yeah, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, certainly on the sort of digital health side of things, you know, we've seen a rapid growth in things like, for example, telemedicine services, and then also kind of cloud-based patient and health data storages, and also the way that one manages, you know, medicines to patients and the kind of supply chain. And then we also see a lot of, and you have to understand that in Africa, and in many developing countries, there is a great, you know, there's a lot of rural communities where it's very difficult to get doctors to them and get medical products to them. And so what we see is development of things like, for example, e-learning for those nurses in rural clinics, because obviously medicine advances all the time. So you need to continue with education. And so that's an easy way for one to actually continue with learning processes in those rural areas. The other thing is very often there's no doctor in a particular clinic. And so things like medical triage become very difficult. And so digital systems for that have been implemented in Africa. Things like logistics for, you know, medication, particularly the kind of medication that you need to continually take. So things like HIV medication, TB medication, and the management of those patients, you know, it's not something which you do for a short while and then it stops. It needs to go on for a very long period. Or sometimes in the case of HIV, for example, it needs to continue forever. So you need to have, not forever, but until the patient, you know, no longer requires it. And so those sorts of things obviously need to be managed, and there are now digital management systems for that, which makes it a lot easier. And then likewise, when it comes to the diagnostic side of things, there is the use now of cloud-based reader systems and the internet and SMSs and mobile phones to be able to generate data based on input from the patient that can then get analyzed and sent back to either the healthcare practitioner or even sometimes directly to the patient, who can then engage with a healthcare practitioner, which provides a diagnosis for them. So if you think about some of those examples, there's something called Mama Ope, which was developed in Uganda by a Ugandan inventor. And it's basically a biomedical jacket which has sensors on it, and they use it to diagnose pneumonia. And the sensors do this by picking up sound patterns and also from the lungs, and also your temperature and your breathing rate. And it then analyzes that data and sends it to a mobile phone application, which then gives a diagnosis. And apparently this can actually work even faster in terms of diagnosis than a doctor can. So this is a classic example of the type of technology which was developed in Africa, for a need that was identified, but could very easily be used elsewhere. So that's certainly on the medical side, some of the innovations that we've seen.
Jo, what challenges do you think African life sciences companies face in relation to sustainable innovation specifically?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue for African companies, of course, is the fact that part of the value of the business and part of leveraging collaborations, etc., and part of generating, interest in a business for investment and that sort of thing is creating intellectual property. And in terms of sustainable innovation, obviously, there is a lot of intellectual property that can be created. And we, particularly in the medical space, would expect to see, because this happens in the developed world, where there's a lot of sustainable innovation, you get a lot more patents that are being filed by those companies. And yet that doesn't seem to be translating into the African scenario. We look at patent filing stats, and if you look at particularly in the disease space, in the communicable diseases, HIV, TB, malaria, less than 0.2% of the patents that relate to these infectious diseases have actually been filed by African entities. And if you look at South Africa, we've only got about 8% of the total patent applications that have been filed in South Africa in 2020 that were actually filed by South Africans. The rest were all filed by foreign entities. And so there's clearly a problem here in terms of protecting the innovations that are coming out of African companies. And I think one of the issues that has been highlighted here is there's quite a high cost. South Africa is one of the, I guess, exceptions where it's not that expensive actually to file a patent application in South Africa. But in other countries, it can be a very high cost in terms of filing, and then once one is filed, even in South Africa, the cost of local enforcement and the efficacy of local enforcement is often, really, really high. And likewise, if you're looking to translate your technology outside of your country, international IP filings and maintenance is very expensive. So the cost is a big issue for Africans, and not only Africans, but certainly in the developing countries, it is a major issue. I think the other thing which we see in Africa, which is an issue, is this what we call innovation chasm. There is still a lack of financial support in respect to developing technologies past the sort of early stage. And it's not just obviously the protection of IP rights, which is going to cause, there's a cost implication there. It's also the actual development of processes and products past that innovation chasm to get it into a commercialization stage to actually produce a project, to produce a product or a service that can be commercialized. And so clearly there are funding issues that are fundamental to the sort of African continent in terms of life sciences, particularly. It's often not low-hanging fruit, whereas in the fintech space, very often it's I guess you could call it low-hanging fruit, because there's not a lot that needs to happen to get something into the commercial phase, whereas in the life sciences, there is. And so we really need different funding options and maybe thinking outside the box in terms of how one funds these sorts of things. The other thing in terms of challenges is, because a lot of the companies can't afford to file patent applications, for example. I mean, even trademark applications might be costly. A lot of them will then look to the protection of confidential information as an alternative. And the issues with that and those other non-statutory forms of protection, including things like unregistered trademarks, is that, yes, sure, you're not paying for registration, but the processes and procedures to actually be able to enforce your rights are far more complex and can often actually be more costly because it's really difficult to enforce your rights in those areas, particularly if you haven't developed proper management policies and procedures in those spaces. So I think those are some of the big challenges for African countries, particularly in the life sciences, where companies are trying to innovate sustainably.
So Joe, you talk a lot about funding, and I can't help to think sort of maybe before we even get to funding, do you think that these sort of companies that are doing these developments sort of in Africa, that maybe there is an inadequate understanding of the, I don't want to say the complexity, but the different forms of intellectual property and the value creation aspect of that? I mean, we see a lot with our clients, even very sophisticated clients, that there isn't really that full appreciation of the nexus between innovation and intellectual property creation and ultimately value creation from a commercial and investor and shareholder point of view. So there are two questions, I think, in there. The one is sort of, what do you see from a understanding of intellectual property rights as such point of view? So let's think of that almost under the heading of education. And the second element is then sort of, do you think there is an appreciation of that nexus that I'm talking about between the innovation and the value creation as such?
Yeah, so absolutely. Your first question with regards to education, there is a huge amount of education that is required. I mean, even in the sort of higher tech life sciences companies, what I'm finding very often is where there's a choice between protecting my IP and spending money on, reagents to get a product to market, I'll rather spend the money on the kind of reagents. And that becomes a real issue, down the line, because yes, sure, you're getting a product to market, but if you haven't protected your IP, you're going to potentially have competitors that are hopping on the bandwagon with you, and you haven't secured that additional value, which particularly in the life sciences industry and particularly early stage, often your intellectual property is really the only asset that you have. So when you're looking for investment, you're going to really struggle to encourage investors to be enthusiastic about investing in your company when you haven't even got intellectual property that's been filed, and your processes are still at the pilot stage. They haven't got to the point where you've got a commercial product. So I think education is key. There needs to be an understanding as to exactly what is actually available to you in terms of intellectual property. And it's not just, oh, I don't have something that's patentable, so it's fine, we don't bother with IP. There is really a lack of understanding that there are things like copyright and confidential information, which are a real, added value to the business, and they need to be considered carefully as well. And then, of course, in terms of it translating into value, if you don't appreciate the fact that you've got this entire spread of intellectual property available to your company, you're not going to appreciate how one can translate that when you are doing valuations to something which actually provides a value to your company. So when you're looking to exit, when you're looking for a merger, if you're interested in investment, those things are going to be left off, and they're not going to form part of that valuation system. But worse than that, they could be forgotten, and the types of mechanisms you need to have in place within your company to provide protection if you ever needed to enforce those rights would often be forgotten as well. We classically see examples where companies will say, this isn't patentable, we're keeping it as a trade secret. And then you explore with them a little bit further. So, okay, it's a trade secret, but what are you doing if you ever needed to enforce your rights? What have you done in terms of confidential information when you are sharing this with third parties? What have you done with your employees? Do they have confidentiality clauses in their employment contracts? What have you done in terms of keeping things secret? Because for trade secrets, one of the key things is you have to show that you have taken reasonable measures to keep it secret. So if you don't have policies and procedures in place, it's going to be extremely difficult to show a court that you have have appreciated that as your confidential information, and that you will want, that you can enforce your rights in that. So absolutely, there is also education needed in terms of how these types of intellectual property can really be leveraged for value.
So Joey, sort of, if I can kind of add something to that, maybe interpret it a little bit also, if we're talking about sort of intellectual property in the context of sustainable innovation, it almost seems to me like the creation of the intellectual property which drives the sustainable innovation is also actually the asset that will allow you potentially to attract and to secure funding to take that very innovation or that benefit forward into a commercial sort of solution, basically. And it's unfortunate, we actually see that quite a lot, especially with earlier stage companies. You mentioned employment agreements, for example, and confidential information, how there's a complete lack of understanding of where intellectual property rights vest when they're created and the steps that you need to take to protect them. There did come in a question while we were talking, a person who is a medical doctor associated with a university, but also being a government employee, and making the point that he has a number of ideas. Sorry, I'm saying he, but the person has a number of ideas that could sort of fall into this category, does some of his own 3D printing to test some concepts. And then there's this problem with who owns the intellectual property in that kind of context, where you've got definitely an employment relationship potentially with a government agency or with a university. In your experience, where people find themselves in a position like that, I'm employed by a university, for example, and I do have ideas, but it doesn't quite fall into my lecturing kind of service that I'm providing to the university. How do I manage that aspect of intellectual property ownership? What can I do to try and actually take my idea for myself or a group of investors and take that forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And your question is equally relevant in sustainable innovation, where there is so much collaboration. Very often a company will recognize a need, they want to do something, they don't necessarily have the capacity within themselves to do it. So they'll approach a university lecturer who they see as an expert in that field and say, we want you to please do X, Y, Z. So the question is, okay, so how do we deal with that? And I think there are two things that one needs to consider. On the one hand, you have to think about what the actual arrangement is between that lecturer and the university in terms of, can they do something outside of their university work? So normally there is something in their employment contract, and very often the universities do have a provision where a certain percentage of time can be done personally, so on personal projects. But obviously one needs to look at that and make sure that that is in fact the case. If the work is truly outside of the scope of what the lecturer is there to do, and that again can be a gray area, because there's going to be a question as to whether that person is purely there to lecture students, or whether there is actually a research sort of component to what that person's job entitles. If there is in fact a research component and it falls within, what the job description involves, it can be a lot easier for a university to say, no, this is actually falling within the scope of what you're employed to do. In which case, in terms of, and very often again, there'll be some sort of either employment contract or a policy that the university has put in place regarding intellectual property that says that if you create intellectual property, which is within the course of your employment, in the scope of your employment, we will own it. And the reason why that's there is because there is also, and this is the second thing, there is a piece of legislation in South Africa, which is the Intellectual Property from Publicly Financed Research and Development Act. And that piece of legislation specifically sets out that if research and development has been undertaken with public finance and intellectual property comes out of that, there are a few exceptions, but basically intellectual property, which is pretty broadly defined, comes out of that, the recipient of that public money, in other words, the university, will own that intellectual property. There are some mechanisms for there to be co-ownership with a private entity. So in the scenario where a company approaches the university and says, we want you to assist us with this innovation project, please can you do X, Y, Z, we will pay you. There are certain components that need to be put in place, including joint intellectual property creation between the two entities, for there to be co-ownership. But otherwise, the the sort of fallback position is that the university will own that intellectual property and not the lecturer. So it's very important to consider both aspects. And when we talk about public funding, it's not just funding for reagents, for example. It could be that the work has been done on a computer that was owned by the university and purchased with public money, or on software which was paid for by public money out of the grant, or done in university premises where it was paid for by public money. So in those scenarios, the only way that you can get out of the legislation actually impacting is for a private company or for the researcher themselves, and this is assuming it's outside of the course of their work, to do that work on a full cost basis. And so that is essentially based on the budget of doing the work. That's the full direct and indirect costs of doing the work, plus a levy, which each university has had to calculate, which they add onto that. And as long as you can do it on a full cost basis, then at least that piece of legislation doesn't apply. So doing work with the university is absolutely possible, and in the sustainable innovation context usually happens quite frequently because, as I say, there's often, a contract in place between the university and a company to do this kind of work. But it is very important to bear in mind that there are these things which need to be dealt with as well. Certainly in South Africa.
So Joe, if I can sort of try to make that practical for myself, advising on commercial transactions and ownership of IP, it seems to me that if I'm in a position where I'm either employed by a university or a government entity or anyone for that matter, and I start working on my own invention, and here we are talking generally now, the important thing is to understand the context, the rules that apply to me. You mentioned the legislation, sort of we know that there are the contractual terms, there will be policies for bigger organizations. And within that framework, firstly understand what my risks are, what my risk to ownership would be if I try to push this invention into a separate entity, and navigate that space. And quite often, that could be going to the organization, the employer or the actor, and say, listen, I want to do something on my own. I need an exemption from whatever set of rules apply to us. I think that's very important for people to understand. Now, maybe then to come back, and maybe just another observation from my side is, and bringing back again this concept of innovation, intellectual property, and this critical role that intellectual property plays in driving both innovation and value. Could be to say, but look, when you set out and you start with this, you must do everything you can to make sure that all of those bits of intellectual property falls back to the company or the owners or whoever it may be. And that's that landscape that you were talking about, sort of the employment agreements. I mean, what we see quite often in due diligence processes for VCs and for investors generally is that the persons who start the business never assigned their intellectual property into the company, for example, or they are directors, yet they're not employees in the sense of having employment agreements. There are no confidentiality obligations apart from the common law, unwritten general confidentiality terms. And all of those things actually build up together a very tight bundle, or it could potentially, of ownership in the company, making whether it is getting finance or investors or shareholders sort of so much easier. So I think, in a sense, what I see in my own practice is taking the hands of these companies and say, listen, we've got to make sure everything is nicely tied up here. And here I'm not talking about registration of trademarks or patents or designs, whatever it may be. I'm just talking about making sure that everything that's created in and around the organization is actually owned where we need it to be owned. So I want to come back a little bit to your concept of funding. You mentioned funding quite a few times. And I mean, in South Africa, I've many times had to deal with TIA, sort of the IDC, some funding organizations. And I'm saying this very, very carefully, but sort of those negotiations are quite often rather challenging. What do you see, or what do you see the role of public funding through institutions like that in Africa to help drive this very important, almost ethical sort of route of sustainable innovation?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in South Africa, that really was the aim of the Intellectual Property from Publicly Financed Research and Development Act, because the kind of context within which that act was formulated was that there needed to be some sort of societal benefit that came back to South Africa. So, I think that there's an understanding, certainly in South Africa, with that piece of legislation, that government plays a role in terms of making sure that there is benefit that comes out of the research that's happening in that country. I can't necessarily speak to the rest of Africa because they're not all, as legislated, shall we say, as South Africa, but there are certainly other countries in Africa which are looking at similar types of legislation to achieve those sorts of things. In the life sciences and in the healthcare space, apart from providing these kinds of enabling forms of legislation, which I guess put a focus on providing some sort of societal benefit when you're doing that research, there is also, of course, the aspect of requiring funding, and that in the healthcare particularly space, where, as I say, it's not low-hanging fruit. There is a real need for more money to be going into that, and for there to be training available so that the entities that are providing that funding are able to, I guess, identify which projects are going to be the ones that are going to go forward most successfully compared to the non-starters. And, when you have countries where they're relatively new organizations doing that sort of thing, and I mean, even in South Africa, where we've had Tia, who's been around for a long time, even they sometimes struggle when you're talking about countries outside of South Africa and the rest of Africa, where these are still relatively new positions. A lot of the people that are doing those kinds of assessments are not usually hugely experienced, and so that's a big challenge, is getting those organizations up to speed to be able to assess what is going to be successful in terms of funding and what isn't. And it's all the more important when you don't have a big pot of funds to go forward. I think in some ways, what we saw with COVID is that there was a lot of interest in Africa in terms of foreign investment into research and development in Africa. And so we've seen, funding of laboratories like Afrigen through the Gates Foundation and BioVac through the Gates Foundation. And, there've been other funding. The European Union funded the Cape Biofarms facility to produce diagnostic proteins for COVID. So we've seen a big interest in Africa in terms of foreign investment that was sort of kickstarted by COVID. But I think what worries me is that we seem to be losing the momentum because, COVID is kind of not an issue like it used to be, certainly on the African continent. And this, first of all, I think the funding is perhaps not flowing as freely as it used to. But I think it's also been meted by a little bit of skepticism because there was funding and there was the promise of technology transfer. The classic example is the Moderna case, where there was going to be technology transfer in terms of the mRNA vaccine production system. But that tech transfer didn't really materialize to the point where you had something that was usable to the point where you could actually produce a product. And so a lot of the work had to be done internally to fill in the gaps. And I think that for me is the biggest concern, is that we do need foreign investment into the research and development in Africa. And it includes the sustainable innovation that's happening in Africa. And I think that's one of the things where there are definitely opportunities to try and leverage that aspect of funding to try and really kind of kickstart what's happening, particularly in the life sciences here.
So Joanne, moving on to something slightly different. Up to a few years ago, every big financial institution sort of almost had a specific dedicated unit or small team looking at disruptive technologies. I mean, you could pretty much go to any bank and they would have had people reporting, in many cases, directly to the CEO or the board, actually, going out there and finding the new payment system, the new sort of how do I bank unbankable sort of people, how do I get loans out there to people. Speaking to a colleague recently, sort of his prediction was that medtech sort of, and that's why I'm thinking here, sustainable innovation, actually, when we talk about these kind of solutions, is probably going to be bigger than fintech sort of very soon. Now, whether that's true or not, I honestly don't know. But what I can say is that what I'm seeing, at least, is that there's a tremendous amount of development in the medtech space. And two questions maybe to you. The first one is, have you come across any of your clients who are actively looking for these disruptive technologies? So if I think, for example, we have a client who developed a emergency services management, so response management system, okay? It's not necessarily an sustainable sort of what we're talking about, but why it's relevant is a diagnostic tool that can communicate with a hospital to sort of provide information on what they should be expecting in the emergency room in 15 or 30 minutes time seems to me to make a lot of sense. Now, this is not science fiction that I'm talking about. This is something I think that we could possibly see in our own lifetimes, but that client wouldn't be looking at something like this. Then we've got clients who are looking at practice management and retaining patients for certain practices and finding new patients. They would be interested in certain sort of aspects of what you mentioned in this discussion. The question that I have is, have you come across clients who are actively looking at the next sort of medtech out there, saying we want to be there when the startup is just getting going to invest in that and be part of that? What do you see in that space?
Yeah. So actually, funnily enough, you talk about medtech, it's not only in the medtech space. So there's actually quite a lot that's happening in the agri-tech space as well. And that's equally important in terms of food security, et cetera, on the African continent. In the medtech space, absolutely. So the classic examples are my clients, Cape Biofarms, and in fact also Zargin Biotechnologies, who are both in a similar space, where it's disruptive technology, where the sort of traditional protein manufacturing for therapeutics and diagnostics was typically in animal systems. And what they're doing is, instead of animal systems, which have a number of issues, cost and risk and that sort of thing, they're looking at an alternative system where you actually use plants. And there's a very easy way to scale up plants so that you get a lot more out of them. And it can be an easier system. So you're kind of doing things cheaper, better, faster kind of thing. So certainly in the med space, we're seeing that sort of thing. We also are, as I said, in terms of digital space, I've mentioned a number of examples where we're seeing that sort of thing happening in Africa. It's not necessarily that they're looking for those opportunities. It's more that there's a need that's been identified. And so that kind of thing has been put in place. Like I said, for example, the triage system, there was a need that was developed there. And so that came into play, where you have diagnostics, where there are a lack of doctors in rural areas, where you can have these systems in play, which can then translate into diagnostics, which are cloud-based and provide SMSs and internet-based diagnostics. Yes. On the agri-sciences side, equally importantly, we're seeing systems like in South Africa, the Abelobi system, where in terms of fishermen, we have a kind of platform-based electronic system where it's possible for the fishermen to log their catch and for the restaurants and the buyers to then access that information real time in order to purchase it. And so it provides this full traceability and documented sort of series of processes through the system, which is fair and transparent. And it also allows the fishermen the ability to prove what their income is, which means they can then start approaching banks and actually get loans from the banks to assist them with building, their own businesses, which before was something that they just couldn't do. So that's one example. There's a similar system that's been developed called Malumas, which does a similar kind of thing, but in the agricultural space, where you have this access to market information between the farmers and the buyers, again, in real time, so that you can see, if you're a buyer, where you can get a particular product that you're looking for, and at the best price. And so that sort of disruptive technology we see a lot as well. So very often it's not so much an aspect of specifically looking for things, but actually identifying needs and then filling those. Another example, which perhaps is more on the side of looking for opportunities, is Mzansi Meat, which was established in South Africa, and effectively they produce cell-cultured meat products. And so there, instead of farming, which of course uses land and water and is not always, environmentally sustainable, they have products which are produced in cell culture. And it's still very expensive and there's still challenges. But if you can, focus on different fermentation techniques and get cheaper products going into that system, things like growth hormones, etc. If you can get cheaper options for entering that process, it makes something much more sustainable as well. And so those are the sorts of things that we are seeing, in South Africa and in Africa, which is exciting.
Joe, I think sort of maybe a note to myself almost sort of from this part of the discussion is that sort of where we have seen, I think, in the fintech space, such a focus on people trying to find the next, I will still refer to as disruptive technology, because in many ways, these sustainable innovations could very well and will very well fall in that same category. I think there's a message for us to send to our clients and for our bigger clients to appreciate that there is a funding need in this space, actually. That's what I heard you say. And if they are able to actively look for opportunities, so someone else may have identified the need before let's say the corporate has done it, but if they are able to find and pick up those opportunities, it creates a funding opportunity for the inventor or the startup, and it creates the ability for the corporate to be involved in the next disruptive technology. And I think maybe we are missing a beat there in not educating our own clients to actively start looking out at what's happening in these spaces as well, rather than to be internally focused, thinking they've got to do their own R&D all the time.
Yeah.
So we got another question that I just want to sort of run past you, and that relates to the patenting system in South Africa. The question basically has two parts. The one is sort of, is there, and I don't know what the answer is, but sort of it would seem that some people at least believe that there is a perception in South Africa that South Africa is becoming more anti-patent, especially in the life sciences sector. How would you respond to that assessment? I don't know what the answer is, but
yeah, I think that the problem is that because we have no substantive examination of our patents, there have definitely been situations, particularly in the pharmaceutical space, where pharma companies have exploited that loophole and have filed a number of patent applications for kind of greening technologies, or sort of small iterations on the invention, which in any other territory wouldn't actually have been granted because they weren't considered to be inventive. But because there's no examination in South Africa, they've taken that advantage and they filed patents in South Africa. They've been granted. And so ostensibly, there are a number of patents on the register that are granted, which prevent you from being able to do certain things if you're a competitor. And in order to challenge them, you're forced to go through the very expensive and lengthy litigation process. And so that it is a reality. There are situations. It's not a fake perception. That really is the case. And so in order to deal with that, the medicines, the patent office and the lobbyists like Médecins Sans Frontières and those kinds of organizations have put together information that led to the development of an IP policy in South Africa, which, amongst other things, aims to introduce substantive examination. And I think if we had to have a system of substantive examination which was effective, and we do have a lot of involvement from, for example, the European Patent Office, who are training examiners. If we have a scenario where we can actually, have good quality and enough examiners to actually do substantive examination, that should alleviate some of those issues. So it's not so much that it's anti-patent, it's more that it's anti-bad patent. And I think if we can sort that out, then, it'll go a long way to prevent the issues that we have at the moment. So if you've got strong patents, our courts are very happy to enforce them. We have a number of cases, and probably actually more cases, where rights have been enforced by the courts, where they've upheld patents than where they haven't upheld patents, if there are decent patents. So I think it's more with respect to that than being an anti-patent country per se.
So, Joe, thank you for that explanation. The second part of this question actually touched on substantive examination, and I like the way that you explained the sentiment and actually the policy that talks about substantive examination to address that this particular practice. So the second part of the question really is sort of whether you think that substantive examination would be detrimental to inventors in South Africa, primarily because of the perceived cost that would be involved.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that is going to be an element of increased cost because you are having to pay examiners, etc. But I think that if you had to do a cost benefit analysis, it's far better to have decent quality patents on the register than a whole bunch of patents which are actually not worth the paper that they're written on. And unfortunately, what we have seen recently is a huge influx of patent applications that are based on basically nothing. They're not really worth the paper that they're written on, but the country where they are coming from has a financial incentive to the companies who are filing and getting granted South African patents. And so we see this huge influx on the South African patent register of these applications, which would never, ever have flown anywhere else in the world, clogging up the whole system because we don't have any kind of checks and balances in place with respect to the quality, the substantive and quality of those patents. So I think, yes, there's going to be an increase in cost, but the benefits will outweigh the fact that we have to have an increase in cost if we do introduce substantive examination.
So it sounds to me, actually, sort of just to put that in my own words, then, Joanne, sort of that substantive examination on a number of different levels would actually be a positive thing. And if I just think back to my own experience from sort of due diligences in respect of new sort of investments and venture capitalists, I mean, if I have a South African patent, it literally means nothing because there's no substantive examination. So yes, there could be a patent, but from a value point of view, you've got to do a number of other exercises to go check that against sort of pre-existing technologies and the like.
Exactly.
So thank you.
That's why so many of our clients, if it's a really important technology and they know they're going to be looking for investment, they won't file their first patent application in South Africa. They'll go and file in the UK or another, examining jurisdiction because they know they're going to get something of worth from substantive examination.
Joe, thank you very much. We've got two more questions I think that we're going to field before we conclude. The first one is sort of kind of a question and an observation. I'm going to read the comments to the group. In Africa, is it really disruptive, as there might be nothing to disrupt, but needs to be established? And that's an interesting concept. Thanks for that comment. Then he continues, so new and advanced intellectual property might not be applicable or appreciated in Africa, and the venture needs to establish elsewhere to get traction. And I think the point that I'm hoping to get across in the discussion here is that I think when we look at language use, sort of, we can't call it disruptive if there was nothing else. So let's say someone came up, addressed a need in, for argument's sake, Ethiopia. They've addressed the need that existed. There wasn't a solution for it yet. How can that be disruptive if there was no solution at the time? I think it's correct. It's not disruptive, but it's also disruptive in the sense that it is changing the way that it would work in Ethiopia. There's now a solution, but that's not the context where we typically use disruptive technologies in.
No.
But in my view, those technologies could be disruptive if they are applicable in an existing jurisdiction or a jurisdiction with more evolved kind of systems, maybe.
Exactly.
So I don't think we should stare ourselves blind against the fact that we can't call it technically disruptive in the country where the problem is addressed. I'm quite optimistic, I'll be honest with you, that some of these things that we're going to see, like we've seen in the fintech space actually, will turn out to be disruptive in more established or other jurisdictions. So I'm not sure if you agree with that assessment.
Absolutely. I do absolutely agree with that. I think very often something which was created in Africa because there was a need makes things cheaper, better, faster in another country where there's an alternative solution, and it allows it to be disruptive elsewhere. And so I think when you're thinking about technology in Africa, and the next part of the question was asking about, IP might not be applicable or appreciated in Africa. I think it's always very important to ask yourself the question of, is there potentially actually an opportunity outside of Africa where intellectual property is going to be equally important? And do we need to think about how we can protect our rights in terms of that outside of Africa as well? Absolutely.
Joe, last question. This is a longer one. I'm going to read it. Please bear with me, everyone. I've observed that entrepreneurs seem to be more driven with pushing end products, while scientists seem to be more focused on solving problems. I believe lack of collaboration influences the low rate of patenting. Higher education curriculum doesn't seem to be encouraging the exchange of knowledge and or collaboration. Do you believe that interdisciplinary collaboration, especially between sciences and business, would influence change? Any suggestions on how to encourage scientists to dabble in business? A fascinating question and observation. Joe, you go first with your comments before I sort of like make a comment.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, and in fact, the IPR Act is actually trying to achieve this. For me, in some ways, the universities need to change the paradigm of how they do things. It shouldn't just be about educating students and getting degrees and publishing papers. There needs to be some sort of societal or community benefit coming out of that education. And there needs to be a career path for the scientists that are coming out of those universities, so that when they leave, they don't just go, oh, I've got a master's, now what? Or, oh, I've got a PhD, now what? There needs to be some sort of an actual entrepreneurial side to what you're doing at university. So the projects that get chosen, I think, should have some sort of an applied research, perspective in them. And one of the ways to do that is to open the doors to collaborate with businesses. Absolutely. And to encourage the sort of interplay between what businesses are saying is a need and what the universities can provide. And our South African universities have got some incredible research happening in them. And so it really lends itself to that sort of collaboration. And I think part of the problem is that the IPR Act, a lot of people perceived as being problematic, don't want to work with universities because you're going to have this issue. But there are so many ways to get around that, which we don't actually have time to discuss. But it's very important to consider that there are mechanisms to work with universities to actually get this going, with as long as you are aware that there are things that you need to deal with, which of course is something we do.
Joe, we only have 3 minutes left now, and I'm so excited about this question, actually. I do still give you a chance to conclude. My observation on this would be, I think, the comment that scientists seem to be focused on solving problems and entrepreneurs on getting to some kind of product is absolutely correct. It's two different, what's the right word, motivations for what people are doing. And I think definitely if we can find a way to get those different mindsets to collaborate more, we will see much more successful application of technologies and intellectual property. And that then leads me to the point where, yes, definitely, there needs to be much more sort of collaboration between people who are business, let's call them business specialists. So I'm a lawyer. I don't necessarily know how to set up a business and run that business and do everything you need to do with that. The same thing with a scientist. I can't expect a scientist who is the bright mind finding the solution to also be the person who understands to do the marketing, the positioning, the funding elements and all of that. And I think we should try to stop trying to be masters of everything and rather find the correct and appropriate collaboration partners to really be able to go forward. And that's actually in respect of everything that we do, whether it's law or medicine or whatever. But I think it's a very sort of astute observation, actually. And then Joe, finally, sort of if you could give some advice to African life sciences companies in light of the challenges that you've seen sort of in this African context, in the 2 minutes that we have remaining, what would that advice be?
I think for me, the most important thing is to understand that, IP really has a huge potential value to your company. And even if it isn't the registered IP, which of course is your kind of first prize, to go for registration and to put in place mechanisms, even if it is unregistered, so that one can, when you're looking for investment, which is going to be key, you can actually show that there's a value to the business by providing that. So it's look for what the intellectual property is in your business and try and protect it. The second thing is that it's really important to understand how collaboration is going to be very often key in this space. And so as soon as you're collaborating, make sure that you have set out exactly who is going to own the intellectual property coming out of that collaboration and how you're going to work together going forward to actually get it commercialized. It's no good having a kind of informal system in place. It needs to be properly transactionally, dealt with. So from those two perspectives, I think those would be the most important things for me for a company that's in this space.
Joe, we've come to the end of this discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the participants who shared some questions and comments with us. We really appreciate that, and that really helped to make this, I think, an interesting discussion. I'm so passionate about this. I wish we could have another hour to discuss this and hear more questions and comments from the audience as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.